Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and wish you a very happy new year to Arun, yourself, and to all the Tax Sutra team and viewers. I'm indeed privileged to be a part of this discussion. 2022, important changes in the international tax landscape, what changes we will see in the domestic law would be interesting. Of course, the most important change would be how the world looks at the two-pillar solution, and a lot of attention will be on the Globe 2 proposals and its implementation. As we all know, this has been an extremely ambitious implementation target. Immediately after the early December release of the framework for Globe rules, the EU rushed into releasing its draft legislation, which has to be incorporated in the EU law. That is the level of urgency with which at least the Western part of the world is looking at it. As far as the US is concerned, the most important change would be how US amends its domestic guilty legislation to adapt to the framework, which has largely been because of the US insistence on how they would like to see the two-pillar solution being implemented. Well, the framework that has been released so far does lend an element of clarity insofar as the changes in the domestic law is concerned. However, we will have to still wait for maybe January or February to see what are the treaty related changes that they will recommend in the framework. Now, the domestic law changes that are being talked about, just to step back a little bit, is more on the common approach. The common approach would mean that if nations opt for the Globe rules, then they will have to necessarily carry out those changes in the domestic law. If they choose not to, they are supposed to be taking note of the fact that the other members in the inclusive framework have taken note of. On the top of my mind, from an Indian standpoint, I would like to look at the following indications. Number one, are there any changes that we will see in the forthcoming budget, which will tend to signify not just India's desire to go ahead with the Globe rules, but also insofar as implementation in the domestic law is concerned? Bear in mind that the domestic law framework changes are equally critical. For example, India needs to have the CFC legislation, which is at the center of the implementation of the Globe rules. There are other challenges I can see immediately, particularly with regard to India as a part of its domestic framework having a legal entity-wise requirement for filing the return. In other words, there is no consolidation. Second, how does the adjustment between the book profits computed under the Indian IFRS and tax purposes reconcile? So these are some of the changes that I anticipate will occupy the mind space of policymakers in India. Well, just in terms of some sermons, if I may say so, India has too many things up in its plate on changes in the international tax policy. We still have a GAR which needs to be tested out. We have the significant economic presence test, which is already there in the domestic law. We have a very strict source-based equalization levy, which also has to be tested out. So the question is, what should India do at this point in time? Well, other nations who are having the CFC legislation are dealing with it. They're trying to align their domestic CFC law with the framework of Globe rules. To that extent, India is advantaged because it does not have the CFC law in its domestic regulations, meaning that should India align its domestic law with domestic CFC law with the Globe rules, those are some of the questions that are likely to come up. So it'll be interesting to see how 2022 pans out not just in terms of the framework under the two-pillar solution in general and in particular on the globe rules, but also how domestic policies in India take shape insofar as the implementation is concerned.
Yeah. Thank you, Mukesh bhai. Thanks so much for that, for the 2022 insights. I have just one question for you on, the budget. Are you expecting anything, a big bang at all in the budget with regard to tax proposals? Every year we have this wish list. Do you think that this will be a little more of a traditional budget and not too many actions? We've seen 100, 120 amendments every year for the last few years, and a lot of changes. You think that this year will be a little more, what do I say, a little more conservative and little more status quo-ish budget, or you're expecting something radical?
I don't know what is a big bang budget. The large message on a reformative budget will continue insofar as tax and non-tax proposals are concerned, and insofar as direct and indirect tax proposals are concerned in the Finance Act. Most of the changes that we have seen have been also occurred outside of the Finance Act exercise. The more important one being taking away the retrospectivity implementation, 15% tax rate on manufacturing. So I don't anticipate budget as a big event, but the larger messaging would be reformative. I think it's too speculative to predict what will happen, but I do see some form of impetus being given to the manufacturing sector and sectors where the employability is high. I also see changes that are coming, that could come insofar as the revamping of the SEZ law is concerned. So one is the revamping of the SEZ law, and second is the changes that will occur in the Finance Act to implement the revamping of the SEZ. Other than that, I think it could be a very, very wild speculation.
Specific question with regard to the budget amendments. A lot of this administrative tinkering came faceless. Faceless was a thrust of 2021. Are you anticipating anything further on those administrative, on the administrative side?
You do not need a budget to be able to carry out changes on the administrative front insofar as implementation of something like a faceless assessment is concerned. You could see some degree of tinkering that could be carried out on the reopening. As you know, that's another issue that occupied the mind space in 2021, whether the limitation that was brought down in the Finance Act of 2021 applies retrospectively or prospectively. Yes, you could see some tinkering in those areas as well.
I can't let you go without your take on the litigation landscape for 2022. Any 2 or 3 big cases? Last year was the case of the software case dominated the headline. This year, maybe the challenge to the faceless scheme in Bombay High Court or whatever it is. The government, of course, is trying to hold out an olive branch. But any big case, Mukesh bhai, you think that is going to, that's going to make waves this year?
Well, the good news is that there is clear acceptance in the Supreme Court for constituting a tax bench, and assuming that that happens, you could see many cases coming up. There are a host of cases on indirect tax front, both on customs, excise, and GST as well, including the arrest purpose. There was famous, marketing intangibles case, which has been lingering now for almost 3 years for final hearing.
Yeah.
So those are some of the big cases.
Yeah, I think Canon, right? The Canon
is the lead case, correct. So those are some of the cases I anticipate coming up, at least insofar as Supreme Court is concerned. Otherwise, insofar as high courts are concerned, Mumbai and Delhi would continue to occupy limelight on tax as a subject.
Thanks so much, Mukesh. Wishing you, on behalf of all the Tax Sutra readers, a wonderful year ahead, a litigation-filled year for you at least. That is Mukesh Butani from BMR Legal, one of the foremost tax experts in the country. Thanks so much, Mukesh. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.